Rust. Not just objectively the best Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 map, but it is also a ubiquitous thing when painting miniatures. Whether fantasy or science fiction, everything gets doused in a big ol' layer of rust if you can't think of anything better to do with it, and it always looks exciting and interesting. It is, however, kinda tricky to actually paint it. And I've got a big ol' base right here, and I wanna try every trick I know and see what is the rustiest rust. The most important thing for a rusty base is to have a whole lot of metal. This is Lord Solar Leontis' base, and it has a big old Dead Chaos Reaver head. I could glue this right down, but I actually want to make it a smidge taller. Right now, the plastic runs right into the ground. Games Workshop does this from time to time, and it's pretty unconvincing. I want to add my own sand, and with a little more room, I can fix it up nicely. I glued his big old noggin down to some 1/4-inch cork, and I tore it away right at the edge. Cork, not just for making rocks, is a great tool for when you need a little bit more height. It's very easy to work with and very light. I glued this down right in the center of the base, and now with some extra room, I broke out my hot glue and I added a few plastic pipes sticking out of the ground. And glued down some extra cork as if these are big chunks of building rubble that have fallen down. I coated the base in wood glue and sprinkled on some large pebbles and sand to fill in the gap. And to build up that gap, I sprinkled more and more sand, sticking it down with super glue. On the cork, I added some wire sticking out to act as exposed rebar, and some green stuff tentacles make convincing wire cabling. To hide the cork, I smeared some plastic putty over the surface, smoothing it out with a popsicle stick, which gives me a very authentic concrete, which is also often smoothed out with wood. Now for the rusty rust. Orange paint is the easiest thing. I like bright, saturated orange. 40K is very extra, and I want fantasy rust, but it depends on just how vibrant you want the rust to be. There are also products like Dirty Down and Games Workshop Dry Paint. Also, does anybody remember Games Workshop Dry Paints? Something of a failed product from Games Workshop's past. Ryza Rust and Necron Compound were okay, and I love the idea of a dry brush ready paint, but Games Workshop's offering just wasn't it. Somehow, my pot is still going strong. This pot must be 6 or 7 years old and still has a little life left in it. I primed the base black, getting it into every nook and cranny, then I mixed up some black paint with a little bit of blue and white to make a dark blue-gray. I took my biggest, rattiest old brush and slobbered this all over. Then I mixed in a little bit more white and did a dry brushing, hitting about 80% of the model. Then a little more white, putting this over 60%, and a little more white, leaving it behind on 40%. And a final dusting of mid-tone gray, hitting the highest points, the face of the Titan and anywhere else I wanted a little more highlight. I went back over some areas with black paint to tone it down and add some variety, with some darker spots and some lighter spots. I used black paint instead of a wash because I don't want to shade, I want to darken, and opaque paint will actually stick on the raised areas. Having dark gray underneath the rust is really gonna make it jump out, and having just a little bit of blue in there is gonna make this base really cold, which will also make the hot, warm rust really shine. But how best to apply that rust? Dry brushing, glazing, mediums? I'm gonna start out with glazing. Bright orange paint mixed with a lot of water. This can be done very sloppily. I actually want coffee staining, drips, and streaking. It'll help to sell the look. I treated this paint like a wash, working it into the cracks and crevices. A lot of the color will disappear as it dries, so I have to wait and see how many more coats it'll take to get it exactly how I want it. Each one brightening the previous layer and creating some gradients through all the layers. I also put this over the ground near the metal. The rain has been washing away the rust and spreading it out over the ground where it's getting deposited in the cracks. The glaze does a poor job of catching on the raised areas, so this is where a little dry brushing comes in handy. I could have done this using my orange paint, but for old time's sake, I used Ryza Rust, rubbing this all over the metal and giving the edges a nice orange glow. And I was reminded of why I never use this stuff. It gets really dry and dusty really fast. Then I picked out more metal with glazing. Although rust forms naturally, I have to pick and choose where I want the rust to be. I left some spots of the Titan's head mostly clean and others heavily corroded. The metal was looking pretty good, but the rust on the base has taken a little too long. I mixed up some orange paint with water and a few drops of flow improver to make it like a wash. This will force the paint to settle into the recesses more aggressively. I splashed this over the sand. Now I have bright orange rust, and I could leave it like this. It sells itself as rust, but it's not very realistic. I decided to add some glazing of a red-brown to darken spots and add in more color variety, and I did the same with the yellow, using this to brighten certain spots of rust, and to make it look truly oxidized. Rust actually has many different colors in it, so using many different colors will help sell the effect. And you know it always has some great effects, that's right, our Patreon. We have monthly terrain packs. This month is the Plasma Pipes, a totally tubular set of power pipes, plants, generators, and roboskeleton workers. With magnet slots, this energetic set is ready to crisscross a battlefield. And if you always want to be up to date on the goings-on at Eons of Battle and be entered into our monthly giveaways, this month we're picking 3 followers to receive this month's terrain. Follow the link in the description to sign up to our newsletter. I'm pretty happy with this rust. I wanted something really rusty, but if you want something a little subtler, you can actually just do these steps in a reverse order. Right after a black prime, you apply all of the rust, and then if you do your dark gray dry brushing, it'll be a lot subtler and it'll keep the rust more in the recesses. But now that it is rusty, I need to make it look like metal. I dry brush silver over the base. Having that metallic glisten will trick the eye into seeing everything on the base as actual metal, even though only a small fraction of the paint actually is metal paint. I'm very happy with this base. The orange is nice and rusty, and the red and the yellow just make it that much more realistic. And although if I hold it right up to my eye, I can see the imperfections, that it's fake. But if I hold it just with a little bit of distance, it really does look like a rusty object. Although, is all of this work necessary when there is dirted down rust? This stuff is liquid talent. Nuln oil is often called liquid talent, but this stuff literally creates actual rust. And I want to compare it to my acrylic paint job. Good old Dirty D is a reddish goo that smells just like balloonies, if anybody remembers that old kid's toy. It's a little scary to work with because it goes on and doesn't look like much. The rust doesn't form until after the stuff is dried. It goes on looking like that awful liquid ketchup water that you get when you don't shake the bottle enough, but as it dries, it gets thinner, super matte, and rusty. It has a mind of its own, but a really nice feature of DD is that it's pretty fragile and can be removed and changed with water. Once it's dry, you can look at it, and if it's not your favorite, you can rub it away with water and a paintbrush, or add more to see if the effect changes. I definitely need to play around more with this stuff, and I suspect texture could play a role in how it decides to rust. On top of the dirty down rust, I threw a little bit more yellow. I thought it could use a little more oomph. The Dirty D made some areas a little too dark for my taste. Oh, dirted down, you tricky mistress, you. This stuff is very good. However, you don't have a ton of control over it. It did some very interesting things on this base. On the underside of these pipes, it kind of rusted up to a really bright yellow, and that looks awesome. I wish it did that on the big skull in the middle and not the underside of the pipes where I can't see it. Similarly, on the back of this guy, there is some more little tightly goodness, and it sunk into the recesses and turned almost into a neon orange just in the cracks, really highlighting them. Looks great. I wish it did that some other places. Overall, it's mostly a very lovely rusty red. But I had something very specific in mind. I want really, really rusty, and so going back over on top of it with a little bit more yellow paint really worked. I do like this stuff a lot for swords and tiny little spears and hatchets. When you have a really small spot to work on, any sort of actual rust is gonna look phenomenal. But when you really need to lay down a large section of rust, it might be better to do either a hybrid or just achieve it with acrylics. Also, this stuff's very expensive. Regular orange paint is not. I painted the edge of the base black and it turned into a lovely snapshot of a battlefield. In 40K, battles go on for years and wars stretch on for centuries. It's very reasonable to believe that a lot of rust could build up in that time. Rust is a great basing scheme, especially for sci-fi miniatures, and it is very easy. I would say it's the other easiest thing to do besides a little bit of brown sand, a grass tuft, and maybe one little skull hanging out. It looks pretty darn good and does a very good job of setting your miniatures in a science fiction-y world. I love a good rust effect. It's one of those things that's simple to do and gives you a big payoff. I like painting a lot, but the big exciting moment is seeing the model finished in my hand, and if I can get there faster more often, then that's what I'm gonna do.